friends, this is Fahad from Game Code Bytes. In this presentation, I'm going to show you how to build a grid-based system using JavaScript, just like the one you see in this demo. Probably I'm going to split this into 2 or 3 videos. And the very first one, we will be focusing on building the grid system and the rendering technique we will be using to render all of those cells, rows, and columns in the system. And also we will do a little bit of optimization so that we don't have to re-render all of these cells over and over again. So let's get started. I just created a folder that called grid-based system, and within that folder I have 2 files, the index.html, and there's nothing in the index.html except the reference to the JavaScript file, and the index.js, which is going to be the JavaScript file we'll be adding the logic to build the grid-based system. That's it. Now I'm going to use the class syntax this time. So I'll create a class called grid system, and then this system is going to have a constructor, this class I mean, and we will be passing the matrix, which is going to represent the grid we want to render. We will have a reference to this matrix equals matrix, so that every time we need it, we will be referencing this matrix. Now the matrix itself is going to be an array of arrays. So every single index in that array is going to be another array, so that we can represent a 2D array, because we don't have 2D arrays in JavaScript, so we have to do this kind of a workaround to do it. So I can create a matrix outside and fill it like this way. Okay. Let's move the matrix to the bottom of the class so that we will be more focused on the class itself. Now I'm going to use a helper method within the grid system, and this method is going to help creating canvases for us. Because as I mentioned in the intro, we're going to use multiple canvases. The first canvas is going to be responsible for rendering the UI. For example, you want to keep track of the score of the player. And then the next layer is going to hold the grid itself. But I would say the static grid, not things need to be moved all the time. And the third layer, maybe we will render the things that need to move on every frame, maybe, or more frequently. So let's create this method. I'm going to call it draw area. I'm going to pass width, height, color, and I'm going to use a flag, and I'll speak about that flag later on. It's basically to say I want a transparent canvas or not. So I'm just going to call it flag for now, but we'll change it later on. And maybe I can just use a default color for the grid. And this flag is going to be false. And then I'm going to say this.canvas equals document.create element canvas. And then this.context equals this.canvas.get context to get the context object so we can draw things. This.width equals this.canvas.width equals width, which is what we passed here. And also the height. And then we will add use the position absolute. As you noticed, we don't have style.css file, so we will do the styles here for only the canvas itself. And then we will say the canvas.style.background, which is going to be the color we passed here. So it's going to be, for example, black, almost black. Now what I would say, if flag is passed, maybe I can call this is transparent, but let's just keep it for now. This dot canvas dot style dot background color equals transparent. Let's just use this name. Is transparent. Okay. And now I'll say this dot style dot margin left equals window dot inner width divided by 2 minus width divided by 2 plus px to center it on both horizontally and vertically. This is going to be the inner height, and this is going to be height, and that should be it. And then lastly, we will say document.body.append child this dot canvas. Okay. And finally, we want to return the context. Let's make sure we don't have errors, and we do have at line 7. Oh, yes. Now, since we have this method, which is the draw area, we can use this to create a bunch of canvases, and then we start referencing the context we need to use to draw things. So I'll say this dot UI context equals this dot draw area 320 480, for example, and let's just use this color. I'll create another one, and this is going to be it's the grid, it's the static grid, so I can just call it outline context. And you know what, since we use this 320 480, the draw area for the UI context should be a little bit bigger, so I'm going to add 100 pixels on the top, left, right, and bottom. And last one we need to do is the draw context, or we can call it the top context. Let's just call it, I'm just going to call it top context maybe. And it's going to hold the same width and height. And here we want to pass the flag of the transparent so that we don't have to see it. It should only live at the top of all of the other canvases, but we don't have to see it. It's going to render the things that needs to be rendered more frequently. And also I want to have a reference to the cell size we want to use. So cell size equal 30. And also we're going to use padding equals 4, for example. Now before we start rendering grid, let's see if we're able to create an object of the grid system and pass the matrix and see if we have errors or something, just to debug things and make sure everything is working. So at the bottom of here, I'll say const grid system equals new grid system, and I'm just going to pass this matrix. Now keep in mind, it happened that I used the same name in the constructor, which is the param I passed, or the argument, and the matrix I'm going to pass from here. So maybe I can just call it grid matrix and then pass it here. And finally, but we still don't have the render, so we don't have to call it. Let's save and see. Okay. We have errors. Cannot read property style of undefined line 16. Yeah, I spelled it canvas, so it should be canvas. Let's see if we still have errors. Line 18. We don't have flag anymore, so we should use is transparent. And line 21, so we have a bunch of errors here. Set property margin left of Oh, style of what? We should be saying canvas. Canvas. Okay. Now we have rendered the canvases, but for some reason you're not able to see it because we are using the same color for the UI canvas and the outline canvas. So I'll use 222, or maybe let's just use 444. So this is going to be the canvas that will be responsible to render the UI, like for example, score, health, or whatever. And this is going to be the outline context where we will be rendering the grid itself. And I would say the static grid that doesn't need to be rendered on every frame. And then finally, the top context or the top canvas, whatever you want to call it, but that one is not going to be visible. It's just a shallow layer over the outline context. And why is that? Because we passed through here, and this is going to be transparent. Now you're probably going to hear a bunch of noises because I changed my location for the recording. I went outside, so you're going to hear some noises from the street next to me. There are a few things I don't like about this method, which is the draw area. The first one is the name. The name is not really descriptive because it is true that it is drawing the canvas, but it's also adding the canvas as a side effect because the main responsibility at the end is the return statement, which is the context. It will return the context. But for the sake of simplicity, let's just keep it this way. But also I'm going to change its name. I'm going to call it getContext. And here we need to use that name. It's still not really descriptive because it is getting the context, but at the same time, it's doing some things under the hood, like it's creating the canvas and the context, setting the width and the styles and things like that. But it's okay for now. The other thing I don't like about this method is the fact that it is public. Now every time you can just call gridsystem.getContext, and we don't want to do that. And to fix this, we need to make this private. And to do that with JavaScript class syntax, we will use a pound symbol. And then every time we call this, we're going to use the pound. Now if we go to the bottom here and we'll say grid system.getContext, it should throw an error saying it's a private field or something like that. And for sure we need to use the pound. Private field getContext must be declared in the closing class. Good. Now let's remove this. And it's working back again. Now the other thing I want to do is that separating this logic here into a method or a function, or I would say a private method within that class, because we're going to need this in later on as well. So I'll create a method, a private method called getCenter, and I'll pass width and height. Then I'm going to take this logic from here and return an object. And this object is going to have x and y. This is going to be the x. And this is going to be the y. Now we can simply say center equals getCenter. Actually, it's going to be this dot pound getCenter. And we will pass the width and the height, and then here we'll say center.x, and here we'll say center.y. We have an error. Let's make sure what's going on. Unexpected token, yes, because I used a semicolon here. Good. Now let's add the render method, and then we will be rendering the grid within that. So I'm going to loop through the rows and the columns of that grid, of the matrix. So let's row equals 0, matrix.length, which is going to be all of the rows in that matrix. And then the same for loop, but we will loop through all of the columns. Call it call. Well, we need to access every column here, so we'll say the column of every row, and then column plus plus. Now we need to decide the color of the cell. If there is a cell, that means its value is 1. If it's 0, that means it's empty. So the color is going to be like this, the decision of the color. So we'll say if matrix of row of col equals, or maybe, yeah, if it's 1, then I'm going to use, for example, let's say orange color. Maybe let's just use blue. Else, if it's 0, that means it's not even 0, maybe 2 or whatever. So maybe we can change this to greater than 0. But if it's 0, then let's just use this dark color. We can also refactor this so that we don't use the color constants anymore. We can just say this.outline context.fill style equals that. And then we'll start drawing the cell, whether it's empty or not. So I'll say this.outline context.fill rect, and then I'm going to position the cell on the x-axis. So I'll say column plus, let's say, this.cell size. Actually, this should be column multiplied plus this dot padding. And then the same logic goes into the row. And then the size is going to be this dot cell size, and the height is going to be this dot cell size, because it's going to be square shaped. Now let's save this and make sure we don't have errors, and we don't. And then finally here we can just call grid system.render. Let's see if it's going to work. And it didn't work. Matrix is not defined, and that's because we should reference it, use this means in the context of the class. Let's save it, and still we have errors. Matrix, where are we using the matrix? We're still using it here, so I'll say this dot matrix, and it's working. Good. Now this is good so far. We are rendering the grid on the canvas, but there's an issue. I don't like the fact that we have the grid position at the top left of the canvas. We need to put it in the center, and that means we need to calculate the new width of the grid based on how many cells we have on the columns and on the rows. And then once we calculate that, we will set up the new width and height, and then we will center it in the middle. And that also means those values, the width and the height for the outline context, and probably even the top context, are not necessary anymore. We can just set it to 0 as well. So let's get into the render, and we'll create a new width and new height. Now I'm going to use a simple math to calculate the width. I would say this dot cell size plus this dot padding multiplied by the matrix, let's say the first column dot length minus the padding, which means the last padding, we don't need it. And then here, we will use the width, the height, the same logic, but instead we will use the matrix length. Okay. Next, we will set up the new width and height for the outline context based on these calculations. So I'll say this dot outline context dot canvas dot width equals width, and we'll do the same for the height. Good. Now it's width and height based on how many cells and columns we have. I mean, how many rows and columns we have. Next, we need to center this, recenter this. Now let's recenter the outline context, or actually the outline canvas. So I'll say this dot outline. Actually, before that, let's call the center, get center. So I'll say const center equals, and actually we have that syntax somewhere. I mean, that logic. I think we used it somewhere, which is here, exactly. But here I will say this dot outline context dot canvas, and here we'll do the same, outline context dot canvas, and it did it successfully. We'll do the same for the top context. Top context, top context, I mean top context canvas. But you'll not be able to see the difference because it's a shallow canvas over the outline context. I have to mention that this is not necessarily a good practice to recalculate the width and the height and then repositioning. But since this is just for explaining the grid system, it's okay. We can cache those values. You can cache those values if you want. But we're also considering if we're removing some of those cells and maybe you'll have the whole row or column be removed from the grid, then you need to do that recalculation. Now let's go back to the outline context and just set it to 0 and set this to 0 because we don't need those values anymore, and it doesn't hurt if we keep it. It will still the same because those two canvases will be recalculated in terms of their width, height, and even the position. Let's change the UI context canvas or the UI canvas color so you'll see the difference. So here I will use another color, for example orange. You see, now we have the UI canvas, which is responsible for rendering text, for example the score or whatever you want to keep track in the game. And then we have the outline context or the grid context, whatever you want to call it, here. And then we have the top context, which is going to be transparent, and that will be responsible for rendering things that need to be rendered more frequently. Let's get this back to maybe 0, 0. Of course, need to fix this. Okay, good. Now you're probably wondering, there are a lot of complexity in building this grid system, but also it pays off in terms of the flexibility of the system. For example, if we change the cell size to 20, we'll still have the grid rendered perfectly, and we will increase the padding, for example 10, and you see it's working. Let's change this to 30 and it's good. 40, and then maybe we need to not leave any padding. Let's put 1, let's put 2. It's still working perfectly. Now let's quickly try to add some text to the UI layer or the UI canvas. So I'll say this dot outline, actually it's the UI context dot font. For example, let's set up the font equals maybe 20 pixels maker, and then we'll say this dot UI context dot fill style equals white, and then this dot UI context dot fill text. And then let's just write this grid based system, or maybe the score. Let's just position it to 2020 and try this out, and it's good. Let's just push it a little bit here. Okay, so those are two separate layers in the canvases. This is going to be the UI canvas. We will be rendering the text, and this is going to be the grid system, and then there is the shallow canvas, or whatever you want to call it, at the surface, I mean, for more frequent drawing. Now let's run another test by changing the grid matrix by adding some more cells. For example, this line, and you will see it is going to be reflected in the grid system. You can think about this as a room, especially if you add a gap here, so it's like a door to this room. And also we can add more data here. And let's add like those columns, those rows I mean, and it's still working perfectly. Alright friends, this is going to be the end of the first video of the grid-based system using JavaScript. Again, sorry for all of the noises happening around me. I'm doing the recording outside and everything is making noises. Cars, airplanes, and air, and everything. In the next video, I'll probably add a player to the grid and make it move and interact with the grid. Thank you guys for watching, and stay tuned for the next one. This is Fahad from Game Code Bytes.